Hope you're all well and that you're finding enough things to do in this time of isolation. My name's Megan and I'll be leading you in a devotion of Psalm 116. So if you just want to turn away, we're going to read it. This psalm is entitled Thanks to the Lord for Deliverance. So, I love the Lord because he has heard my appeal for mercy. Because he has turned his ear to me, I will call out to him as long as I live. The ropes of death were wrapped around me, and the torments of Sheol overcame me. I encountered trouble and sorrow. Then I called on the name of the Lord. Lord, save me. The Lord is gracious and righteous. Our God is compassionate. The Lord guards the experienced. I was helpless, and he saved me. Return to your rest, my soul, for the Lord has been good to you. For you, Lord, rescued me from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling. I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living. I believed, even when I said I am severely oppressed. In my alarm I said, everyone is a liar. How can I repay the Lord for all the good he has done for me? I will take the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. I will fulfill my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people. The death of his faithful ones is valuable in the Lord's sight. Lord, I am indeed your servant. I am your servant, the son of your female servant. You have loosened my bonds. I will offer you a sacrifice of thanksgiving and call on the name of the Lord. I will fulfill my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people, in the courts of the Lord's house, within you, Jerusalem. Hallelujah. So just before diving in, I think it's important to note that in the Bible, in Matthew and Mark, in two different places, it tells us that Jesus and his disciples sang just before going to the garden the night he was betrayed. And this song is thought to be from Psalm 113 to Psalm 118, as it was a common song to sing during the Passover. So this is a point that I'm going to refer back to, just so we can think of the significance of this psalm at this point in Jesus' life. So this psalm begins with a simple reason for loving God. The psalmist loves the Lord because he answers his prayer. And because of what God has done, the psalmist wants to be wholly devoted to him, calling out to only him for the rest of his life. And he resolves to trust God only. Perhaps as a linguist, I like the fact that the verbs God has heard my appeal for mercy and has turned his ear to me, they're in the present perfect tense, which means that God has done this in the past, but it's still continuing while the psalmist is writing this, which is such a comfort to know that God has always been listening and still is. The next part in verse 3 and 4 describes to us a moment where the psalmist was in a moment of complete helplessness. Perhaps this is a feeling that many of us are feeling right now, as we feel like nothing in this world is under our control. He uses the strong words of ropes of death and torments of Sheol. These can feel too real right now for our own lives. But what is interesting, in Acts chapter 2 verse 24, Peter uses this same language to describe how the Father lifted up Jesus. It says, God raised him up, ending the pains of death, because it was not possible for him to be held by death. If you're a Christian, I'm sure that is so comforting for you to know that Jesus has suffered like us. But yet, if we concentrate on the second part of that verse, it should comfort us all the more that not only has Jesus suffered the same as us, but he's different. He has overcome this suffering, and not just for himself, but for all of us, and he overcame it once and for all. We then see the psalmist meekly cry out to God. He recognises that he himself can do nothing, but his God can do everything. In this psalm, we time and time again see a desperate man who's exhausted. He's at the end of his tether, yet every time he recognises his weakness, he turns to God. This is where he finds his hope. He praises him and cries out to him. That means today, if we admit our weakness, coronavirus related or not, we can cry out to God, trust in his strength, and know that we will find our hope. This next part from verse 5, certainly for me, was one of those moments, when you're reading the Bible and you can just feel your heart beating wildly in your chest because you feel overwhelmed about who God is, what he's done for us. And this psalm tells us that God is gracious, righteous, he's compassionate, he watches over the simple-hearted, and he saves us when we are helpless. God is painted in a beautiful way here. And the psalmist does what God deserves in light of his deliverance, and he worships God's character. We also see that we don't have to exalt ourselves to get God's attention, but in fact it's when the psalmist is brought low, God brings his salvation. The psalmist then commands his soul to return to rest, to reflect on God's goodness and what he has done. If you yourself are a Christian, you should strive to rest on God's goodness in all circumstances. A quote by Sturgeon says, "Whenever a child of God, even for a moment, loses his peace of mind, he should be concerned to find it again, not by seeking it in the world or in his own experiences, but in the Lord alone." From verse 8, we see the testimony of the psalmist who was delivered. The severity of his crisis is highlighted by saying how God rescued him from death. Knowing that Jesus sang these very words with great confidence in the face of his future death and tears should bring us encouragement in the face of our own trials. Jesus knew that he would be delivered from this, knowing that he would again walk in the land of the living. The psalmist says that he will walk before the Lord in the land of the living. To walk before God is an expression that is both demanding and reassuring. In the words of Kinder, as we are wholly exposed but wholly befriended. This attitude that the psalmist has to what God has done, where he wants to boldly live for God, and continues into the next part of the psalm, where we see in verse 12 that his gratitude drives him to want to respond to God. He wants to give something back to the one who has given him everything, the one who restored his hope. By then wanting to take the cup of salvation in verse 13, his gratitude drives him to want to receive from God. And this verse is particularly poignant if we think of Jesus singing it, knowing that it was him who would be the sacrifice. Jesus, who just after singing this psalm prayed to his Father in the garden, "If it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." He was obedient to his Father even to the point of death, and it was him who became the ultimate sacrifice. Whilst this psalm in general is a celebration of deliverance from death, the psalmist knew that death is inevitable for all of God's saints. But we also read that God counts these deaths as precious, as it is that removes the final barrier between us and God as we enter into his presence for all of eternity. Whatever the consequences of the virus are in our personal lives, if you're a Christian, you can live with the comfort of knowing that if you die, you will one day be in God's presence where you are fully loved. Thinking of Jesus saying these words again, we can reflect on the fact that he was the Holy One, and so his death was and is the most precious. It's his death that is what gave us the opportunity to be reconciled to the Father in heaven. And the psalmist then pledges his life to God, both as son and servant, recognising that he has been set free in the Father. In verse 18, we see a repetition of what's been said before in verse 14. This keeps us at the altar, at God's feet, publicly showing our thanksgiving to God. The psalmist's cries at the beginning were heard and answered by God, but he doesn't want to stop his relationship with God there. The psalmist wasn't just looking for a quick fix to his problems, but he wants to walk daily with God, boldly in front of men, nurturing his relationship with God. Let this be a challenge to us, and I hope that we don't just cry out to God in this season and then forget about him when this is all over. Let us cry out to God now, worshipping him, and when all of this is done, give him the glory for all that he has done, not just now, but for all of eternity. And let us remember the words of 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 10, which say, "So I take pleasure in weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and in difficulties for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Now, of course, this strength doesn't come from within us, and thank goodness it doesn't, because we are so weak without God. So I'd just like to leave you with this. This is taken from a little devotional in my Bible. So when you're feeling completely out of your depth and helpless in these times, remember this. Being weak is our greatest strength when it leads to desperate dependence on God. Being helpless is never hopeless when it leads us to the cross. So if we acknowledge our weakness and trust in God's strength, we will find abundance of hope. I encourage you in these coming days to try and rest on the promises of God, to remind yourself that it's Him who's in control, and like the psalmist did, find your hope in the one who gave his all for us.